I'd like now to introduce our final session for today. This is Dr. Frank Furedi and Professor Anthony Elliott. Frank is the Emeritus Professor of Sociology, University of Kent, on the far right, and Visiting Professor, Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction, University College of London. During the past 15 years, his studies have been devoted to an exploration of cultural developments that influence the construction of contemporary risk consciousness. He has published widely about controversies relating to issues such as health, parenting, children, food and new technology. Anthony is the Director of the Hawke Research Institute, University of South Australia. He's the author and editor of 35 books, which have been translated into dozens of languages. He is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences of Australia, a Fellow of the Cambridge Commonwealth Trust and a member of King's College, Cambridge. The discussion this afternoon is a conversation between the two of them, unfacilitated, about risk, fear and terror. Why has the 21st century emerged as such a confronting and indeed at oftentimes terrifying world? How did the late 20th century experiences of consumer affluence and geopolitical stability transform so swiftly into 21st century social vulnerabilities and political uncertainties? In this provocative conversation, acclaimed UK public intellectual Frank Furedi discusses with Hawke Research Institute Director Anthony these issues and others which dominate our lives over these times, ranging from the spread of new social risks to the globalization of terror. Furedi charts out a vision of a world in which people must struggle to reclaim their independence and freedom. Please make them welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Christy, for that very kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Frank Furedi and I just arrived into Melbourne from Adelaide about an hour or so ago. We walked into the conference here to be, I think the first people we saw were wearing these very bright red jackets, which at first I mistook for maybe the new CHASS uniform. I discovered they're students from Scotch College. But Frank Furedi has flown from the UK. We brought him to Adelaide. He's delivered a masterclass yesterday, and we put him on a plane to come to Melbourne today. So what I'd like to suggest we do in this final session is, as the conversational mode will indicate, it's going to be a little more relaxed. Just at the outset, and before I launch into starting this conversation with Professor Furedi, I just at the outset wanted to express my thanks to CHASS. This is the first time that the Hawke Research Institute has partnered with CHASS to be at such an event. Particular thanks to its director, Stephen Schwartz, for all the help that he's given us. I think this theme is an absolutely fantastic topic, and I just wanted to note that whilst we're certainly in, I think, exceptionally challenging times for the social sciences and the humanities and the creative arts, certainly one point I just wanted to note about how the Hawke is currently faring is that whilst the pressures of Category 1 are upon us all in the higher education sector, it's also important to bear in mind that there is a world bigger than Category 1. Certainly there's been a lot of media attention in recent time on the funding of the International Centre for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding at the Hawke. It's a $10 million research centre, which has been an absolute game changer at the Hawke. And just more recently, in the last few months, the Hawke has won a grant from the European Commission to establish a multi-million-dollar research centre, a Hawke EU Centre on Mobilities and Migrations. And it seems to me it connects a little bit to the previous topic that we've discussed about in terms of freedom of speech and academic freedom. Very important that we have these sources of funding to be able to do the sorts of work and intellectual research to which so many are committed in the social sciences and the humanities. Well, Frank, good afternoon and welcome. I'm struck by the fact that someone that worked with you previously used to work at the University of Kent, where Frank has been Professor of Sociology for many years. This is not your first visit to Australia. In fact, I think we're up to counting 7 or 8 trips. You're a fairly regular visitor to Australia. I think the last time you were here, though, Tony Abbott had a different job. He was the opposition leader.
That's right. That was a different world, or maybe not. Yes, I think that Australia I find very interesting because although Europeans think of Australia as being in a different world, it's very, very far. And although I know that Australians are actually very defensive and are often uncritical in their internalization of the worst European ideas or the latest European ideas, nevertheless, I've always found that Australia is intellectually and culturally a very exciting place. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of openness to new ideas, and there's a buzz about Australia. In fact, my partner was saying that if we had been, sort of 30 years younger or maybe 20 years younger, it would be a good place to come and live.
The title of this particular session is Welcome to the 21st Century, Risk, Fear and Terror, topics to which you've returned time and again, actually, in your intellectual contributions over a number of years. And we're going to get to all of that. But I wanted to start, as it were, by asking you a few questions about your intellectual biography and your own kind of personal biography. You were born in Hungary, Frank, and you spent your early childhood years in Budapest. Just wondered if you could tell us a little something about that, in particular how your family came to move to Canada after the failed 1956 uprising.
Well, I think the 1956 revolution, I was 9 years old at the time, made a huge impact on me. Because everybody was talking politics. It's the first time I saw ordinary people go on the street and take matters into their own hands. And I was very much in awe of that experience where you see the baker who yesterday was making rolls, now organizing the transportation of food from the countryside. And you see what we call badly educated people, sort of somehow getting the intellectual resources and the confidence to run affairs, and my whole family was very much caught up in it. My sister, who was 18 at the time, as old as 18, was organizing the bringing in of flour and food supplies into Budapest from the countryside. And my dad was on the workers' councils in the 5th district. So it was a big thing. The revolution was destroyed, and we had to flee. And we had a family conference. Where are we going to go? There were 4 places on the table. Australia was one of them. Australia, Canada, Sweden, or England. And after a lot of debate, Canada became the obvious place, given the fact that it wasn't, sort of as far as Australia, but it wasn't as close as Sweden, to Russia, I mean. And we ended up in Canada, where I became involved in politics in the 60s. I'm a 60s person, one of the few 60s person that has no apologies. I really enjoyed the decade. And I thought that was a wonderful time.
But do you remember it, Frank?
I do, and I do. I was always sad in terms of social interaction. While everybody partied, I was reading books. But I do remember the 60s. And the one thing I remember of the 60s, which is particularly relevant for the kids in here, sort of the people who are still in school, is that in the 60s we all thought that everything was possible. Now, I know that today that's often regarded as ever so naive and ever so silly, but I think the sensibility that anything is possible, that when you go out in the world, you leave a world behind that's very different, was one that inspired a lot of us. And I think that having that kind of energy, that kind of spirit of the age, is something that I still maybe parasitically live off even in my declining years. I think there was an incredible buzz about it, and made many of us very radical. I think I was one of the few people that stayed radical a bit longer than most, because I didn't realize that a decade had gone by, that it was now 1979. But I felt that was a very unique experience, and I'm often sorry for my son, who's 18, just going to university, that he has lived through a time when he's never had that privileged position of feeling that anything is possible. We have a much more conservative, very restrained kind of political atmosphere.
In the late 1960s, you left Canada and moved to the UK and studied the University of London, where you did your doctorate. And then into the early 1970s, you seemed to become increasingly involved in radical politics, being a key player and founder of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Now, today that might surprise some people here, given some of your recent books and so on. But I just wondered what sort of lines of continuity. Are there lines of continuity that you see? I mean, you seem to have been a person, for example, that's spoken about the protection of the private sphere in terms of the wider intrusion of government and so on over a number of years. What are your reflections on that and that time from your radical work in the radical politics in the early 1970s?
Yeah, I often have difficulty answering the question because a lot of people ask me that question, not you, but others, assume that I'm a different person, that somehow I've changed. I always think that the world has changed, but I'm not all that different to what I was in the 1960s, 70s. And now I think that there's two impulses that continually captured my imagination. One was the state. I mean, you have to remember that I grew up in a highly organized, semi-totalitarian, Stalinist Hungary. And my whole family, hated everything to do with the state. And we had this ethos in the family that the way you talk to each other was very different than you would talk to public officials. You couldn't really trust them. And I was always wary of authority, in public authority. And I always felt that, even with the best of intentions, they ended up doing things that, wasn't really good. And I think I had that in the 1970s when we had the famous miners' strikes. I was involved in a lot of trade union works, and spent most of my first 10 years in university more on the picket line than actually in the classroom. But that was also part and parcel of that, where you felt that if you're going to change things, then you had to minimize the influence of the state. So that was one influence. The other influence was, I always felt that we kind of flourish most by the way we interact with one another informally. It's the quality of our relationships in communities and also within families. I always felt the private sphere was really quite important for that. That allowed us to have the strength to make our way in the world. Private sphere, people make fun of it, but it's the only place where you can take your social mask off. We all wear social masks, we all act in public, but there are times when you go back into your bedroom or you're with your lover or your best friend and you feel, now I can be myself. And we need to do that. If we're not able to be ourselves, whatever that means, then it becomes very difficult to fight the big battles out there. And that's one of the reasons I think I was one of the few people on the left in the 1970s that felt strong that the private sphere was an area that you couldn't just simply retreat from and just give up on.
Yeah. Which brings me to the sort of topics under consideration, and let's start with fear. I mean, for a number of years at Kent, you were a professor writing lots of different academic books, and then in the late 1990s, you published a book, Culture of Fear, which really established and put you in touch with quite a different audience. This, I think, really represented a breakthrough in many respects. And the argument of the book in a nutshell, and very crudely put, it seems to me, is that you seem to be suggesting then that in this world that's now increasingly obsessed with stranger danger, abuse, climate and environmental damage, that a kind of fear culture, as you called it, a fear culture takes hold and starts to spread incessantly. Some critics viewed the book's success, I guess, they read it against what was happening in the UK at the time. It seemed to be a kind of post-Thatcherite sense to picking up on the kind of mood of cultural fatalism. How do you think of that book now, and why do you think it struck such a chord with the public's imagination?
Well, I think the reason why it had a bit of an impact was because people's own individual experience was one that kind of related to that, so that even people that would politically or culturally disagree with me would nevertheless, for example, I wrote a book called Paranoid Parenting, which was very much linked to that, would know very clearly that the way they related to their children or the way that the adult world dealt with kids was fundamentally different than in the past. I mean, you don't need a PhD in history to know that the way we treat children now is historically unprecedented. We literally immunize them from everyday experience. I mean, everything to do with a child comes with a health warning. So even if we disagreed with the big issues, when it came to the personal ones, I think people could really see that the world they were living in, for example, this obsession with pedophilia, I don't know if it's as bad in Australia, I think it is as bad in Australia as in England, acquired a momentum to the point at which, it means that, a society reorganizes life around the expectation that most strangers are pedophiles. And when you have that kind of extreme reactions, then something new has happened. I think that people could really sense that, even the ones that I was arguing with, because it was really part and parcel of their life. Fear had become a resource that they too had internalized to the point at which it defined their identity.
In that book, Paranoid Parenting, I mean, you were making the argument, among others, that parents need to be able to parent, but effectively they can't do so in a world in which everything's being treated as dangerous. And again, I just sort of wonder, say, 10 years on, how you see the plight of children's freedom today. I mean, there was an article you wrote recently where you were talking about the arrest of Deborah Harrell in the United States, an American mother who was charged earlier this year for leaving her 9-year-old daughter at a playground while she worked at McDonald's, some 600 yards from the park.
Yes, I mean, I was very much emotionally engaged with that article because my mother used to work, and I used to be left at home when I was 5 and 6, and sort of didn't traumatize me or anything like that. But that was, if you're a working mother, sort of in the world that we live in, you do have to make those kinds of judgment calls. And the fact that she was imprisoned and denounced as being irresponsible, I thought was, really kind of made me think about the world we're living in. What I also realized, sort of, is when I did a final edition of Paranoid Parenting, is that when I wrote the book and published it in 2001, there were a lot of things you could do with children that you could no longer do anymore. In 2001, when Paranoid Parenting was published in England, you could still take photographs of your child in a nativity play. It's now forbidden. In 2001, you could take a picture of your child playing football. Now you have to ask the permission of every single adult around the football pitch, which is impossible. You're not going to do that. So there's a lot of things that children could still do, had the freedom to do, that are now regarded as irresponsible or illegal. And I think in that sense, what we've seen is a decade where these problems have become mainstream and routinized and institutionalized to the point at which young parents no longer have any idea what it used to be like not so long ago.
So paranoid parenting was a kind of, culture of fear application, as it were. And then, in a sense, you repeated that exercise, but in a radically different way in the next book, Therapy Culture, a book that charted out the rise and rise of therapy, through which you argued we were seeing an increasing range of human behaviours now being pathologized. Now, that was a work that, like the others, it spoke to an audience beyond the academy, but there was a lot of harsh criticism too. A number of critics, certainly psychotherapists, feminists, some sociologists as well, argued that you'd failed that you'd developed actually a sort of overly bleak and rather stark perspective, and that the perspective was one that was a little too deterministic, that we're apparently all of us being increasingly caught within the web of therapy culture. Again, I just wonder, 10 years on, do you still, how do you respond to those criticisms, and do you think the reach of therapy culture is still as strong as it was when you wrote the book?
I think even more. I think what has happened is that we got a new vocabulary, which is entirely based on therapeutic concepts. The concept we use now that was never in existence when I was a young man, called well-being. You use well-being, and we use it to the point that we have well-being indexes, and nations are measured. And of course, when well-being is something that you have to accomplish, the presupposition of that is that the norm is that we're not well. Right? If well-being is something you got to achieve, then the assumption is that actually most of the time, unless we get it, we're sick. And I think this normalization of illness, which particularly with young people, where mental illness of all sorts are regularly diagnosed, where you have in Southern California more than a third of the boys on Ritalin, because they're a little bit active. I would have had hyperactivity. I would have had the diagnosis like this, because all my friends, we were like this kind of when we were 9, 10, 11, and 12. The ease with which these diagnoses are made, and what's even more worrying is the energy with which they are adopted, because people are now finding that the only way they can have an identity is if they got a diagnosis. It becomes almost a kind of something that we kind of encourage. It gets to the point at which so you come to my university. Every time there's an examination, you can see that the line of people to the counselor's office gets bigger every single year. And we got this new concept called exam syndrome, which in my day used to be called shitting yourself because you're worried about your exams, right? But it's now got a diagnosis to it, and it's taken seriously. I mean, the queue is getting longer and longer, and then they come back, oh, little Mary's got half an hour extra. Oh, little Harriet, is upset because her boyfriend left just before the exam. We'll give her an extra 10 minutes. I mean, it becomes so normalized that we trivialize real mental illness. I mean, I actually think mental illness is a problem, but if we trivialize it, every single condition becomes mental illness, then we lose sight of the real chronic conditions that deserve society's care.
Okay, so in the last session, the term lived culture was referred to, and it seems to, part of your argument is that is our ordinary experience is increasingly shaded by this kind of culture of fear. I want to sort of shift that up a gear to now start to ask you some questions about your work on terror and your thoughts about terrorism, given the title of this particular session. In your book, Invitation to Terror, you wrote, I want to get this right, so let me quote you here. You wrote that the West's official reaction to terror is driven by a narrative of fear that invites us to regard terrorism as incomprehensible, senseless, and beyond meaning. Today's dramatization of security reflects a sense of helplessness that inadvertently offers society's enemies an invitation to come and terrorize us. What I want to ask you is, who are society's enemies there, of which you write, and why has the incoherence, the kind of ambience of the enemy itself, become such a pressing political issue in these early days of the 21st century?
I think what has happened is that as society become increasingly vulnerable in the way it describes itself, and increasingly worried about taking risks and becoming much more risk-averse and loss-averse, what it actually does, it sends out a message saying that we are worried and we're scared. And I thought it was very interesting that a couple of weeks after the bombing of the World Trade Center, one of the guys who runs Al-Qaeda in Europe put out a message, a video where he basically said, you Westerners fear death. We sort of kind of think, we kind of embrace it. And a lot of people thought that was just a lot of rhetoric and everything else, and aren't they, isn't Al-Qaeda so narrow-minded and fanatical? But actually what he was really saying in the language of sociology that I speak is you people are kind of risk-averse and loss-averse. You regard risk as a threat and as a danger. We regard risk-taking as an opportunity. And the more risk-averse you are, the more you fear losses, the more you invite us to kind of give you a kick up the rear end. I mean, and I think a very good example of that, most of you would have seen or heard about this video where they're beheading these people in the Middle East. It's what we call, what I call in my work, a performance of fear. It's entirely performative. It's really staged, sort of, when you actually look at the video, it's very much a staged video. What's interesting about this video is that it has had a bigger impact on the American public than any other news event in the last decade. And when you actually think about it, I mean, obviously it's a horrible thing, but it's one individual being executed. Right? It's not exactly a global catastrophe. I mean, the very week in which this video was being discussed, hundreds and thousands of people in northern Iraq were being buried alive and killed and executed by ISIL at the same time. And that got like 3 column inches. That wasn't really cool, wasn't that interesting. I mean, there you had a real catastrophe occurring of major proportion, but this one video was enough to capture your imagination, not only capture the imagination, but to the point at which governments were organizing their policy around it. Grown-up, mature Western governments in Australia and in England and America were organizing their policies because they were worried about the impact that these videos were having on their own population. Right? And I think that what that tells us is that in many respects, what we're doing is we're asking for more of these performances. I mean, our reaction, the way we reacted, tells people who are making the video, this is a big success, right? This is a real result for us. what else can we do to scare them? And I think that in that sense, that's why the book is called Invitation to Terror. We're inviting them to terrorize us. Instead of saying, well, actually, we can live with those horrible events. We're a mature society. People get killed. We can live with that and find ways of defending ourselves and gaining security. Instead of doing that, we kind of play the game of almost like demanding to be terrorized, and that's what the argument is.
I want to come back to that, the notion of playing the game and this demand to be terrorized. I just want to signal, because we haven't done this actually with our CHASS organisers, that I am actually going to set aside a little bit of time for Q&A. Yeah, that's okay. Frank, the ism at the end of terrorism is often, it's thought, suggests a kind of, very coherent wall-to-wall ideology, yeah? Hence the so-called stated need for a kind of global war on terror as launched after 9/11 by Bush and Blair. But arguably, today's streamlined, made-over, social media-friendly brand of terrorism appears much more diffuse and fragmentary. I just wonder, could you say something about, these decentered, whether you think it's right to even think of terrorism in terms of networks and decentered networks, and particularly their kind of hankerings for the kind of pushing a line of anti-consumerism, anti-modernism, and so on?
Yes, I mean, you raise a number of very interesting issues. One of the things that I discovered in my research is that the rhetoric and the narrative of radical jihadists, particularly among kids, is not a million miles away from American and Western youth culture, and also more radical culture. I think it was very interesting that when sort of the guy that used to run Al-Qaeda, the guy was killed. What was his name again? The one that got killed in Pakistan, Bin Laden. When he gave his message to America, talked about environmentalism. He talked about the role of women. He basically was taking American cultural concerns and recasting them into a radical Islamist form. And if you look at some of the jihadist videos, the way they use rap music and hip hop and various other culture, it's them. It's meant to be Islamic, but it really sounds like something out of Los Angeles. That's kind of reframed within a particular Middle Eastern kind of narrative. So, in that sense, what's interesting about this reaction is that it's a synthesis of kind of Middle Eastern, sort of, or Islamic, an attempt to create an Islamic ideology that's different than that existed in the past with the latest Western accoutrement.
Yeah. Now, you've been writing about this recently, and you wrote a piece a few weeks ago that was carried in The Australian, and it's caused, I think, quite a lot of interest where you pursue some of these themes, particularly where you introduce this notion of a kind of reinvention of young Muslims as radical jihadists. And in that article you wrote, and I want to quote this, you wrote, "The question worth posing is why radical Islamic ideals appeal to young people who've often benefited from life in the West. It's clear that their embrace of radical Islam is coupled with a rejection of the way of life of their parents and also of the communities they inhabit. Many young people who find it difficult to gain meaning from their experience in the West react by rejecting Western society. Their Muslim peers sometimes go a step further and express their alienation through the medium of a jihadist outlook. The attraction of this outlook is that it provides a coherent and edgy identity." So some terror then, you seem to be saying here, is symbolic. It's aesthetic or kind of corporate. We're talking essentially, are we, about jihad as kind of cool?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you talk to young Muslim kids, certainly in England or in Holland, who are 17, 18, 19, 20, some of them are very educated, they really think this is very cool. When they see the beheading video, you might think that's not very nice, but they kind of think good result, and that's because in their own minds, what has happened is that they become switched off Western society. They actually loathe everything to do with Western society. They're also very uncomfortable with their own background. They're also rebelling against their own parents and their own culture. It's what we call in sociology a double alienation. They're estranged from both their own past, but also from the society where they're kind of growing up in. And I think what has happened is that they've kind of then bought into a movement that's developed independent of them, because I think there's an independent Middle Eastern movement to which they then kind of embrace and then and reconfigure it in line with their Western experience, which is why you have a lot of these kids, they go to Syria, they kind of do a bit of fighting and they kind of do a few, and then they realize that actually they should be with mom and dad because this is not what they were expecting. So it's a very interesting, both disturbing, but sort of a worthwhile development to look at. But the important thing to remember is that the real problem always is the inability of Western societies to give meaning to their experience. And I think that's what we should be concerned about and looking at. Why is it that Australians or Dutch or English people and their societies aren't able to give young people the kind of meaning they need to make their way in the world?
I want to ask you some questions about, given the way you've sketched out the global risks, I want to ask you some questions about political leadership and what you think of the kinds of leadership that we see on offer at present. I mean, global risks, if you think about the notion of a global risk, it's not surprising, therefore, to see that global risks have generated various narratives about different kinds of global destiny, particularly the global destiny of the West, with all that might imply for various sacrificial victims along the way. Recently in the UK, where you live, David Cameron stated that, and I quote, "The fight against Islamicist terror is this generation's Second World War." What do you think of Cameron's approach here and of the recent warnings to those British citizens travelling to Syria and Iraq to join ISIL?
Well, I think Cameron is the victim of the English education system, which doesn't do history all that well. But the very idea that Second World War becomes the mirror image of what's happening today does violence to both experiences. I think there are huge problems that we're confronted in the present time. I don't want to diminish its significance, and I think that we're living in a moment where the Kurdish people are literally fighting for their survival. I mean, they are faced with what is an existential crisis, for their culture. And it's interesting that very few of us are talking about the Kurds at the moment. I also think, by the way, it's very interesting that, I don't know if you read in the newspaper about that Kurdish woman who basically was the first suicide bomber against ISIL. She went into amongst the ISIL troops with hand grenades, took out 18 of them. And I tweeted immediately, how inspirational, how heroic and everything else. And then looked around the press, in this country and in Britain and France. And you would think that this heroic, inspirational act never happened. You got to ask the question, why is it that something that we ought to see as a real blow for freedom just passes us by as we're talking about fighting Second World War over again? And I think there's a kind of, I call it a crisis of causality, which leads our political leaders to kind of almost effortlessly construct these empty symbols that they themselves don't believe in. I think the interesting thing about Cameron's speech is that it was written by a speechwriter with media training who said, well, we need to say something. And somebody scratched their head, oh yeah, Second World War, yeah, that sounds good. But actually, Cameron doesn't really believe that himself. And that's the sad thing about leadership today. There really isn't that kind of strength of conviction that you need to, have the clarity to fight these battles.
Well, let me try you out then on the Australian Prime Minister. In the wake of the recent terrorism raids in Sydney, the Australian PM Tony Abbott commented that a terrorist attack involving the random beheading of a member of the public could have happened within days, and all that's required to carry out such an attack in Australia is a determined individual, a knife, an iPhone, and a victim. Is this scaremongering? Is it fatalism, or is it pragmatic analysis? What's at stake here, Frank?
Well, obviously, I'm not privy to the internal state of the Prime Minister in terms of why he made the comment, but I think that it is very interesting because it's almost as if he's read my Invitation to Terror and he's adopted the script. He says, so if you listen to what you just said, beheading somebody, beheading somebody, you need a knife, 2 hands, and an iPhone, and absolutely right. So that's another way of saying, bring it on. I mean, that's the only conclusion you can draw from that. And the more you indicate, the more you normalize beheading. We now had 3 or 4 beheadings of people in America you haven't heard about. where even domestic violence conflicts get resolved by beheading somebody, and somebody in England got beheaded now because it's just been normalized. And I think, I don't want us to censor videos, but if we create a cultural climate where beheading is the expectation, then you are going to get it. So when I think that it's a wrong statement to make, I think it's also irresponsible of our political leaders to give a focus on this issue, to kind of it's almost like a kind of pornographic fascination with this traumatic event, instead of moving on and asking the question, what can we genuinely do within Australia itself to inspire people to do good things rather than just simply prevent them from doing bad things?
Okay, so that's really brought me then to the last question I wanted to ask you, and it goes back to that point you made about playing the game and, in a sense, your expression, the invitation to terror. Do you think, or what do you think of the current time? And is the time, do you think it's ripe for any kind of far-reaching rethink, really serious political rethink of the conditions and consequences of the kind of culture of fear that you've been sketching out? And in particular, do you think that current world imbalances in terms of terror can be addressed?
Well, I think that, the conclusion that I've drawn is that we need to live with terror, learn to live with terror, which doesn't mean to say we acquiesce to it or adapt to it, but we create the conditions where we can minimize its destructive effects. We've got to find ways and means. I'm not a pacifist. I've got no problems with going to war or anything like that. But we have to realize that that's not going to go away, because all these conflicts are no longer there in the Middle East. It's not 1,000 miles away. It's everywhere. I also think we live through very exciting times. And I think that one of the things that has occurred in this world of uncertainties is that many of the old answers have been exhausted. Political parties are very fragile internally. They lack the intellectual or the moral resources to sound convincing. And this is a time when new ideas are creeping up. In Europe, at the moment, we have the rise of all these populist movements. Many of them say things that I disagree with, that I'm uncomfortable with. In my country, in England, where I live, we have UKIP, which is this new populist movement. A lot of people are against them. I don't agree with them at all, but I think it's actually a good thing that the political system gets shaken up a little bit and people are forced to rethink. I was talking to a bunch of A-level students. They're 17, 18. And we had a discussion precisely on this subject, and one of them said, I'll never forget as long as I live, he said, Frank, I really wish that in England we had a left-wing UKIP, And I thought that was a very interesting statement, because he didn't like UKIP, but he reckoned that UKIP was shaking up the system. He was left-wing. He knew there was no outlet for his left-wing ideals, and that was the answer that he provisionally kind of came up with.
Frank, we've got a little bit of time left. Let's just open this up to any questions and comments from the floor. There's a question or comment from gentleman just over here in the white creamy jacket.
John Beaton, I'm number 6. Actually Executive Director of the Academy of the Social Sciences. But what I say carries no distance beyond my own voice, okay? I do not speak for the Academy. Anthony, first
Sorry for not recognizing you, John. I've got a light shining down on me here. I can see it is you now.
There's a halo above my head. Anthony, thank you so much. I'm going to nominate you as Social Sciences Michael Parkinson. You are superb at what you are doing here, and thank you very much, Professor Furedi, for taking the trouble. A couple of things. One, it seems to me that the distinction between the 20th, 19th, 18th centuries and earlier and the 21st century is this thing and everything attached to it. Everybody knows everything automatically around the world. Somebody draws a cartoon in Denmark, and somebody gets their head chopped off in the Philippines, for instance, because of that. That is a crucial thing, but let's set that aside for the moment, and I want to take up the question of what do we do apart from the war thing. Now, like you, I'm a child of the 60s, not in Canada, but downstairs where the big party was going on, we like to say. And At that time, and into the 1970s, there was terrorist activity. There was, for instance, I think the Red Brigade, they were called in Italy. The Italian solution was to hunt them all down and kill them. End of Red Brigade. That's a very difficult thing to do and can only be done in limited circumstances. But there was another thing that you made me remember when you were talking about cool and radicalism. And that is, at the time there was the Black Panthers. And I think it was Tom Wolfe, somebody may remind me or correct me, who wrote a book called Radical Chic and Mau Mauing the Flatcatchers or something. It's a brilliant book. And what they did with the violent radicals who were the self-proclaimed Black Panthers, they were not Islamists, they were African of origin, but they were very angry, was to lionize them. And before anybody knew it, they were being invited to all the chicest parties. And that somehow diffused the Black Panthers. I mean, there was a lot else going on at the time, but recognizing them and incorporating them into places they never expected to be incorporated actually turned the volume down on radicalization. What, in your opinion, is the better way, rather than trying to kill them all, to pull people back from radicalism, turn down the volume of it, and try to build societies that are more peaceful?
Okay, thank you, John. Frank.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think we have to remember that even the Black Panthers never had the energy and the power and the global movement behind them that the jihadists have. So there's a kind of, although they were doing similar things, we're talking about a qualitatively different kind of problem. Because I was mainly talking about the Western expressions of that, but it's also a much broader sort of aspect to it. And I think in Europe, they've tried to do what you suggested. There's been a lot of attempts to incorporate them, and that's going on all the time, you know, sort of at all kinds of levels in Scandinavia, Holland, and Belgium. Even in England, there's been attempts to sort of incorporate it. But I don't think that works for a very simple reason, that the people that you're incorporating tend to usually be the people who are not the activists, not the ones that are involved in this. I think that you know, sort of there are many aspects to the problem, but the one thing that I feel is can be addressed and needs to be addressed, not just simply to fight or to contain them, is we need to have a more grown-up attitude towards public debate and political discussion. It seems to me that one of the problems that we have in Western societies is that politics has become extremely technical, highly instrumental, very rarely discusses normative issues or problems of value. It means as a result of that, you know, sort of, it's not only that we don't have ideologies, but even basic moral concepts no longer exist. What I really object to is that it's almost impossible to hear a politician say, this is a good policy or a bad policy, or even use a moral word like, this is good or evil. Instead, they hide behind evidence shows, research says, you know, sort of, it's almost everything is so compartmentalized that, you know, democracy acquires this very, you know, sort of narrow, you know, sort of superficial character. And until we create a situation where these issues can be discussed in a grown-up way, where young people in particular, because it is really about the younger generations who need to be drawn into public life, not on their terms, not on our terms, but on the basis of a dialogue. Until that point, these problems are not going to go away, and that seems to be the question that we need to address, and that's the one area that we continually refuse to deal with.
Well, I don't know if any of these young people here want to be drawn into the public sphere. We've just got enough time for one more comment or question, if anyone's got a very brief one. Okay, gentleman right here in the middle, and we do need to keep this comment brief. Thank you.
I'll try and make it quick. I'm sorry, I'm not young, but just to say...
you look young from here.
Thank you very much. Peter Tregear from the Australian National University, but I'm just going to ask her, perhaps it might have been Dorothy Dixon, but to what extent, in fact, we actually we reverse the thing. We're sort of assuming that there is a genuine threat. What if we take another position and say the threat is actually, for Australia, actually not that great at all? And we've, of course, just been in a week where we've had, needed to remind us, if we did, there are going to be many more deaths the next year, and already have been this year from domestic violence than there have been, I think, in the last 10, if not 100 years for terrorism on mainland Australia. And of course, we've had the great theatre of that up in Brisbane. And I'm just thinking, of course, the last time when Australia desperately needed to manufacture an enemy at home would have to be the start of the First World War, when we did everything we could to pretend that there was a live enemy at home and locked up third-generation Germans and so on.
Okay, so I'll take that question there, that it's overblown and
that we're manufacturing an enemy.
Yeah, manufacturing an enemy. Frank?
Well, I would agree with about one point, which is that the threat, in the way that it's represented, even though it's real, is essentially fairly minimal compared to the threat that exists in Middle East or other kinds of societies, and that in general, sort of we should be much more worried about, like at the moment, I'm much more worried about the problem the Kurds are facing, which is a historically different level than about your problem, the threat you're facing or I'm facing. So there's a disjunct there. I think that we often have this very bad habit of inventing or imagining. I don't think people actually invent it. It's very rarely the case that people make things up, but they imagine, they see things that are not really there. And I think that what that leads to is it's much easier to pass a law to ban something, right? It's much easier to ban something or to criminalize something than to actually deal with the problem politically or intellectually. And I think that's the lesson that I would learn. So I'm not against sort of doing things. I'm not for kind of allowing homes to be blown up or bad things to occur. I do think that if we could somehow devote the energy we're devoting towards finding administrative and bureaucratic solutions to what are real public problems, political problems, if you could somehow use that energy to politically engage with these issues, I think we'd end up in a much more secure society, but also a more vibrant, flourishing, stimulating society.
Okay, so sadly, look, we are out of time there. Frank Furedi is a visiting fellow presently at the Hawke Research Institute. He's in conversation again tomorrow in Adelaide, and he's with us for the remainder of this week. But Frank, I'd like to ask everyone to join with me now in thanking you for coming to CHASS today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to add to that, thank you very much for coming, Frank, and to Parky. I agree, you've been a fabulous host. I have to say, without diminishing your obvious extreme intellect and content, that I think your articulation and voice is like velvet. It was a pleasure listening to you.